So hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, which is consumer research and panel sizes. So today I'm joined by Thomas Marquardt in Germany, who is the head of our German franchisee and is going to be able to talk quite well about the statistics behind some of the decisions here. And I'll be looking at a more regulatory point of view. But just to say, this webinar is being recorded and I'll send out the recording afterwards. And there's also going to be a Q&A at the end. So feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box as we go through the webinar and at the end, and we'll be really happy to answer those. So this has really come out of a very common question that we're asked by all of our clients, old and new, which is, how many people should I have on my consumer study? And there are so many different kind of factors that we have to take into account to make this decision, both from a statistical point of view, but also from the regulatory point of view. So we really wanted to summarize that and kind of give you a really in-depth view on how we make that decision, just so you can see what kind of things we have on board. Because another thing we often get is, why does it have to be that big if we kind of make that suggestion? And, we're not just saying it because we want to get lots of money out of you. It's because we want you to be able to use your data and use it really well. So to give you a kind of summary of what we'll be looking at today, we're going to be looking at globally compliant panel sizes. Again, what makes it globally compliant? A lot of information about the statistics, hopefully in an easy to digest format. We'll be looking at the marketing benefits of having good size samples as well. And how that helps your brand visibility. And we're going to be sharing a case study as well, which will help summarize kind of how that decision's made and the impact it has on the results as well. So Thomas, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks, Carys. For those who don't know me, I'm Thomas, and as Carys already mentioned, I'm heading the German part of Ayton Global Research currently. I spend most of my time, well, almost my professional life in market research, most of the time in Unilever, where I had a number of first local, international, and global roles. Having done this for about 20 years, I felt like it's time to leave, and I created my own market research consultancy. And as I said, I took over the German head of Ayton, which allows me to fully live my passion of getting market research a bit closer to the market and making sure people understand what's happening in the market and not living on going on blindly without realizing what consumers think.
Great, thanks, Thomas. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm the regulatory director at Ayton Global Research. So I've been at the company for about 8 years now. Started off as a study manager, so kind of a client account manager essentially, and getting to know how we design studies, which obviously is making us think about things like panel sizes at that point. But most importantly, I'm now looking at the regulations that are involved in what we do. So mainly advertising laws, also generally FMCG laws for compliance with claims, so very particularly cosmetics, because that's where we do a lot of testing. It's where you see a lot of claims. So that's where I'm really looking at kind of providing information, as I said, in particular relevance today, what means, what helps our clients make globally compliant decisions with their studies to make sure they can use it in their advertising. So yeah. So I really want to start off with what is consumer research, because I've just mentioned that a few times. That's what we conduct at Ayton Global Research. But before we talk about panel sizes, there's obviously different types of research that you can do to substantiate your claims. And we really want to focus on consumer research today. There is going to be slightly different implications to the panel sizes you're choosing to use. Generally, for a consumer research study, you want to use more participants because it's subjective research. It's based on people's opinions rather than a measurement. So it's still very valid. It just means that you kind of have more room for difference of opinion. So a larger panel size is generally better. And we want to make sure that we're covering the kind of consumer population as well. So we'll talk about that in some more detail. But basically, there are self-assessed claims, perception claims, commonly known as, that we're substantiating. And generally, they're in-home user studies. So people are sent products to test at home and they give their opinions online. They are really a successful way of gathering data about the actual conditions of the product in use. So things like your usage directions and stuff like that you put on your packaging is what will provide volunteers when they test it at home. So we're really reflecting what your consumer would do if they were to purchase your product online or in a shop and take it home and use it. We want to make sure we're really replicating those claims. So this is where you can have a space for both clinical and consumer research, but really consumer research is so valid to making sure that you're getting that actual conditions in use. So you can also look at testing the efficacy of one product or maybe comparing others. And we're going to talk about that as well today, and the difference that you might have in considerations for comparison claims as well as single product tests. So I'm going to talk a lot about claim substantiation, but I also want you to think about the other reasons you might use consumer research data. And consumer research, again, is a great way of getting lots of other market research conducted about your product, as well as thinking about substantiating those claims, because you are sending out products, so either nationwide or internationally to your target consumers. So getting feedback on what they would perceive about your product is really essential for directing your new product development. So things like product and brand perceptions, packaging design, establishing price points, these are all things you can gather through consumer research data. I would say that we do, for claim substantiation, conduct our studies blind, so unbranded samples, but there is no reason why we can't ask efficacy questions about the products with this blind sample with the unbranded products. And then once they've answered those questions, reveal that branding and say, now you've tested the product, what do you think about this branding? How much would you pay for it? So it's a really good way of combining this. You can also do it the other way around and conduct market research with us first to find who your target consumer is. We really do have a real homogeny between the claim substantiations part of consumer research and that market research side as well. There's also things like comparison testing, as I mentioned. So that might be benchmarking against competitors, but it might also be testing your own formulations. You might want to investigate new markets and see how your products are accepted there, or indeed investigate those markets to substantiate your claims. And there's also other marketing material you can gather, such as photos and videos and testimonials and reviews. I kind of like to give this information before people really think about the claim side, because think about what else you can get out of this consumer research. There's a lot you can get from it. There's some examples of claims on the side there as well. As I mentioned, they're perception claims. So really we're looking at, people agreeing with the claim rather than stating it as a fact necessarily. So people agree their wrinkles appear reduced. Marketing claims, as I said, so things that you can't really prove with science, it's an opinion. So recommending a product is a really good one. And again, we've got things like parents assessing products on their children. So it gives you a little bit of a demonstration there as well. So Thomas, I'm going to pass over to you for a really good case study to start thinking about this sample size.
Yeah, thanks, Carys. We took a simple one. See then the outline here. We had a manufacturer over here in Germany who makes cosmetic products, and they were going to test an eyeliner, just a very simple one to validate claims, and of course also to check on the efficacy of these products. We had it fairly simple. We had 120 respondents to get at least 100 responses. So normally we over-recruit by 20% because you never know if everybody receives the products by post or some people get ill or whatsoever. So we guarantee 100 responses. We had a fairly broad recruitment criteria. Also, we just needed women using liquid eyeliner and of course being healthy and other typical other restrictions. And we had a 2-week in-home study with a questionnaire at the end. So people got the product sent to their homes, could work with the eyeliner and at the end answer some questions. And I won't go into the details of the questions, but just pick out one and just show you some of the end results. So most of you will have seen the kind of typical charts that we have in our standardized report. So we had one question: the eyeliner is waterproof. You saw that 112 people responded. We had a 7-point scale in terms of agreement. This client wanted to have the positive words first, the negative one at the end. This is a matter of philosophy. We can do either. And we saw that there was a vast, very large proportion who agreed. Overall, which is evaluated, you have a mean score of 4.97 on a 7-point scale, which is pretty good. And you see behind that, which many people do not read, a kind of 95% CI, 4.66 to 5.29, which means is the confidence, 95% confidence interval, and a standard deviation of 1.69. And I'll come back to these figures in a minute. At the end of the report, you will also find our typical satisfaction rating, where we normally say that about two-thirds of the people agree to the statement. The claim is validated. Over here, we had 72% who were in the scope of, in this case, 5 to 7. So clearly, claim is validated. Overall, a big tick. Message achieved. Claim validated. The product performs. Client is happy. But I want to show you a little bit why it's go a bit into this kind of statistics behind it and explain a bit more why this is important. And I know that most people now will frown and run away shouting, crying, because people hate statistics. Look back at their math sessions at school. But I'll try to keep it simple. Why do we do this? And what's the confidence interval? The key thing is, in the end, of course, we would like to know the real value for all women in Germany who use liquid eyeliner, but we can't. First of all, we don't know them all, and secondly, we can't ask them all. So that's why we have to take a sample, which we did over here, where we had 120 of those people. And the confidence interval is a range that is likely to include the real value with a certain degree of confidence, which is the confidence rating, the 95%, where population mean lies between an upper and a lower interval. So we had over here, we said between 4.66 and 5.29 is the kind of 95% confidence interval, where the mean score, which means the average for all women in Germany, will be. 95% probability also means the opposite holds true. So if we have 95% probability, we have an error margin of 5%. So we in 5% of the cases, we might be wrong. So we can never be 100% sure. If you have a sample, you can also have a very odd sample and very strange sample. And it also means in 5 out of 100 tests, in this case, you would have a wrong mean and a wrong result. Can happen. But that's why we try to minimize this risk and make it clearer. Okay, having said this, I can go to the next chart, which sounds even more frightening. But I don't want to go in the detail. The key thing is, you see the formula for a confidence interval up there, which means x, which is the mean, plus minus z is the value that is depending on the probability you give, and the standard error. And key that I wanted to highlight down here is that in the denominator is the square root of n, the sample size. Which means, if you think back, the bigger a denominator becomes, the smaller the value becomes, which means also the higher n, the smaller the confidence interval becomes. And this is key for understanding sample size. The use of n in the denominator means the higher the sample size, the smaller the confidence interval, given all other things the same. But the other thing is realizing that there's a square root of n, that shows that this is not a linear function. And I want to show this on the next slide, where on the right-hand side, you see the square root function. Again, another function, that is statistics. But you see that, on the x-axis, you've got the sample size. On the y-axis, you've got the resulting square root. So you see that for 50, it's about 7, because 50 is 7 times 7. And you see that it increases a lot in the beginning, which means you have a lot of volatility in the beginning, depending on the sample size. And also you have a very low denominator. So if you get a sample size of 10, you would divide by 3. If you got a sample size of 50, you would divide by 7. If you got a sample size of 100, you would divide by 10, which means the higher, the smaller the confidence interval, and it creates and above 50, it becomes fairly stable. At least definitely more stable than below 50. Below 50, it's completely unstable and unreliable, which means you must never go below 50. With 100, you achieve some stability. If you go higher, you get even more. By the way, I just thought back at my Unilever times, where Unilever gave the recommendation to have a sample size of 250 for consumer tests, which clearly shows that you really want to achieve some stability. And they enforce this in all tests. Okay. Next chart. Building our example, we saw the mean score was 4.97. We had the confidence interval, and I tried to visualize this over here in just a very simple score. You see the lower half and the upper half of the confidence interval, and in the middle is the mean. Just to visualize it, but it will be interesting in the next chart where we compare this. What happens if you have take a lower sample size? And what I did in this example is just randomly halved the sample. So I took 56 out in one half and 56 in the other half, but randomly. And what you see over here is, if you look at these two samples, which were just subsets of the original sample, that first of all, they deviate from the original one. You see in one half, you've got a lower mean, and in the other half, you've got a higher mean. In the end, of course, this will come to the overall same mean. But what you also see is that it spreads broader, which is what we've seen before with smaller sample size. You get a broader confidence interval, which gives you a broader scope of the potential real mean and less reliability. Still, we got similar results. But what I did next to see the next chart, whereas took it to another extreme and made 3 subsamples, random subsamples, which, as you can see over here, deviate a lot. So you really have very, very different results over here. You also see how now with the sample size below 50, how big the confidence interval becomes. And that is really very difficult actually to draw conclusions from this, because the mean in the first third could be anything between below 4 and above 5. So very, very broad spectrum that in the end you can't really interpret, can't take conclusions from. So this would also mean for the validation of claims. If we look at the figure below we we see that we had a 72% people who were satisfied. But if you had chosen a small sample of and just chosen randomly the first third sample, you would only have come to 57%, which means you would have rejected the claim, even if it is in reality a valid one. So again, this shows that you need to have a fairly good sample size to have reliable results.
Great, thanks, Thomas. And kind of putting that into the context, as Thomas said, with the claim, when we're thinking about splitting the data down into groups, obviously that's not something you're necessarily going to do unless you're looking at investigating separate groups. And that's what that demonstrates really well. So let's say, for example, we're kind of splitting the sample into skin types. It really shows that overall, you can use that data together, make sure that you can get an overall result for your claims, but then you might want to look at the skin types themselves and see if it's accepted with each one. And as Thomas demonstrated then, if one group doesn't have a pass claim, you can't include their data overall. So to make it really clear, I'm not saying you can cherry pick your data. You can't remove people that disagree with it. Exactly. Just to make that clear, because I don't want people to take it that way. But if, for example, so in this case, we said we had half people that had sensitive skin, half the people that had normal skin, and that half that had sensitive skin didn't accept the product. They weren't happy with it. It didn't work with their skin. We're not including them in the overall data. We're removing them entirely. So we're not saying, oh, we're going to choose, all the ones that disagreed, we're going to get rid of them. We're literally removing that entire subgroup and saying that it isn't appropriate to use the product on sensitive skin. That we can do, because at the end of the day, the consumer research is also about investigating your product and knowing who it is accepted with. But in this example, the reason why it's really important is we're saying, you might not want less than sort of 30 people per subgroup or something like that. Obviously, if the sensitive skin doesn't work, you're then only left with 30 people, which, as we really demonstrate with the statistics, anything under 50, obviously higher is better, but really anything under 50 is completely unreliable and it will not be significant for advertising. So that's just a really important consideration to say, in that real context, there is these examples where you'll have different subgroups. It might not always be accepted by each one. You can look at excluding those skin types or whatever it is in that subgroup, quoting that in your advertising so it's very clear they're not able to be included in it. But you need to be left with enough data that you can still make your claim. I hope that all makes sense. It's a very long way of saying it.
No, but indeed, but to add to that, I think it's also good to keep in mind right from the start which subgroups you might want to look at, and make sure that you have sufficient sample size for each of the subgroups that you might want to look at separately. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense.
Exactly. And I think that real guideline that we've kind of gone through there, I think 50 per subgroup is always going to be a really safe bet. It gives you enough that if you had to remove a subgroup, you've got enough data on there. But also, it could also be argued that 50, anything under 50 wouldn't be reliable enough to say, an all skin type claim or something like that, because obviously there's not enough there in the first place. Every platform will be slightly different as well. This is a hard thing with regulation. There aren't always clear guidelines here about what is accepted. So as Thomas said from this example in Unilever, they chose a really high amount because they know they're going to be really safe going to any kind of platform to advertise. I know, for example, that with Clearcast in the UK, if you're based in the UK, they won't accept any less than 40 per subgroup for an advertising claim. Which I think is still really low, but it gives you an example that even if you did 30, that wouldn't even be allowed on television. So you need to be really aware of what these kinds of regulations are. At the end of the day, look at the statistics. That would be my guideline. Instead of seeing what you can get away with on a regulation point of view, what will give you the best statistics, what will give you the most confidence in your product, and use that as your guideline for choosing that panel size. So I kind of touched on it a minute ago about regulation, basically. But for those of you who haven't done a lot about ad self-regulation and how ads are basically regulated globally, I just want to give you a bit of a summary and a bit of a kind of signpost to where to look. So generally, we're looking at ad self-regulatory bodies. So these are the ones that exist globally. Lots of countries have their own self-regulatory organization, and some countries that don't will use influences from other ones and put it into their laws. So it's really important to be aware of. Almost all key markets will have their own self-regulatory organizations. So you really need to be aware of who that is. But essentially, as I kind of keep saying with self-regulation, it is a way for the industry to regulate itself. So instead of someone having to police every single advert that's out there, it's up to you as one of these three parts of the industry, whether it's the advertisers who pay for the advertising agencies responsible for the form and content, or the media that carry it. If you're any of those three, it is your responsibility to regulate yourself, know who the self-regulatory organization is in the country that you're selling your product, read their code of conduct, and make sure that you're abiding by the rules. You can still get in trouble. So obviously you can kind of get away with it if you don't do it, because as I said, it's regulating yourself. But the main thing is they work on a complaints basis. If you have a consumer who uses your product and says, okay, this said it's going to make my hair 10 times stronger, well, it's all falling out, they're going to complain about your product to these advertising regulations, and they're going to ask you for where the evidence came from behind your claims. It can also be your competitor, though, which is actually where you're more likely to find a complaint from. So although consumers might use the product, sometimes people don't really complain. There's a general politeness, especially in the UK, where you'll use a product, go, that's rubbish, and just never use it again. But much more likely to complain about you is going to be your competitors, because if you're making claims about your product that they can't make about theirs, or that they are making, but they've invested a lot of money into it and they don't think you've done the same thing, or they can't find your evidence anywhere, so they don't believe you have it, they are the ones that are going to complain about you to these self-regulatory organizations. And that's where you're going to find yourself in hot water if you don't have any evidence. So it's really important to be aware of and not try and get away with, because it can be a very difficult situation. Every country is slightly different. You can have things in Australia and USA, you see a lot of lawsuits. So if you have misleading claims, you could get sued, which you really don't want to go through. It's very expensive. But even in the UK, it's generally more of an ask to take down your adverts, which if your claims on your pack copy could be a whole entire product recall. So absolutely need to do it. If you don't remove your adverts, obviously it can go down that very expensive route, because you're then disobeying the law, because it goes into trading standards. So all very important to be aware of. The kind of signposts that I want to give you, because I don't go in too much detail about who these regulatory bodies are, but you've got the International Chamber of Commerce, and they've got a framework for a self-regulatory framework, which countries can adopt, and a lot of countries have. So there's about 52 countries that have adopted that. Again, those real key markets. So you can have a look on their website, see who's adopted it, and you know that they're all kind of working around the same code. There's also ICAS, which is the International Council of Ad Self-Regulation, and they've got a list of all their members on there. Basically a network of different SROs who come together, have same shared values, put the same news together. But again, as I said, they've got their own global database, which is really easy to use. If you don't really know where to start, you can kind of go on there and say, okay, that country, that's who it is, and I know that they're part of ICAS. So it's a nice starting point for you, basically. But in terms of specific panel sizes, I wanted to bring up the ASA advice. So basically, there is no clear guideline, as it says very, very clearly at the top. And this is what we always say as well. There is too much varying difference between claims and products that you're looking at. So you can't have a set sample size. And it's very much the same as us. When people ask us, how many people do we need to have in a consumer study? I say, well, it's usually about 100 responses, but it really depends, because as me and Thomas said, if you're looking at 50 per subgroup and you want to make a claim about all skin types or hair types or curl types, all these different things, it's going to be more than that as well. So it's really difficult to kind of give this set panel size. But what the ASA have done is put out some really good pointers. I would hasten to add, even if you're not based in the UK, the ASA are very good at putting out information that's very applicable to lots of different countries, particularly in Europe. So this advice will really carry through to a lot of different countries as well. So obviously it's really up to you as the marketer to ensure that panel size is sufficient to adequately support the claim being made. So when I'm saying it's up to you, you can ask us. This is what your testing house is there for. You don't have to go, okay, well, I'm just going to say 30 because I only want to pay for 30 people. That's what I'm going to do. This is really where you need to seek advice from people like testing houses like us, or other regulatory advice consultants, because we're able to really give you some clear guidance there. But basically, the ASA is not going to tell you. It's up to you to have it right. So if they come up to you, you'll have the evidence there. It needs to be enough to produce statistically significant results, which is what we've talked about a lot today. They need to be statistically significant. So you need to make sure it's, got that confidence interval that's very clear, and you haven't kind of got quite, insignificant results essentially, because otherwise it's going to be misleading. And that's what these advertising regulatory bodies are all about. They're making sure you're not misleading the consumers. They're protecting the consumer. So it's really what we're trying to avoid. Obviously, it says smaller panel sizes make it difficult to demonstrate. So smaller, again, not necessarily given a number there, but it gives you an idea that big is better. You shouldn't ever rely on small prints. And I thought this was a really good thing to bring up, because as I said earlier, if you're looking at breaking down those results and then saying, okay, well, we're going to remove those subgroups, we're just going to do normal skin or whatever, you can't really rely on that and say, okay, this product is amazing at making your skin feel nourished and soft and hydrated, and then in small print at the bottom say, but only for people with normal skin types. You're kind of relying on that as a claim, whereas you should really put it into your whole advertising. You should make it very clear from the set. If you can only have a certain subgroup of people that can use a product, it should be very, very clear from the get-go that that's who it's appropriate for. So it should never contradict the impression, essentially. We don't ever add any complexity as well, which I thought was a really good thing about it, and how people have to interpret the information. What they see is what they should get. That's always the case with advertising claims. You should always look at making a representative panel, and I thought this was a good one as well. It's something that is also really come into play a lot over the last couple of years, whereas before people just were like, well, we'll see who tests it, don't really care, or usually very much women if it was a cosmetic product all the time, whereas a lot more people now, a lot more brands that work with us do want to have at least some men on the study, and certainly also looking at ethnicities as well and making sure they've got at least a nationally representative panel to make sure it's inclusive. This is really important because even the ASA are bringing it up. And if you don't have a representative panel, you should make it very clear. So, you know, a lot of our customers still do test on women for cosmetics. It's going to be a very common thing for always. They know who their target consumer is. So they might say, we want women above the age of 35 because it's a wrinkle cream. That's who's going to purchase it. That's absolutely fine. But when you put your claim on your website, you must state it's just women. You can't say people, because that suggests that everyone's used it. So it's just a really another good consideration there. And you need to ensure that it's an accurate reflection of the data and not an exaggeration of the results. This is obviously very obvious, but again, you would be surprised. Things like making it seem like there's more people on the panel or making it seem like it's a higher percentage, just avoid it completely. And I said, it sounds really obvious, but you would be amazed how many people will come to us and say, we don't really want to have the people that disagree. Can we just have the people that agree and say, but take them out? So instead of, 90% of 100, can we say 100% of 90 people? No, we can't say that. So you would be surprised, but we need to make sure you're really reflecting the results you actually get. So in terms of large panel sizes, we've obviously talked about this kind of significance in statistics and also the significance in regulation, but I also want to talk about the significance in your marketing and how much better it looks if you have a larger panel size. So I just got some really nice examples of some really successful products from some of the really big players in the game and what they're putting out there. So the first thing is looking at TV ads. So you can see there's a couple of hair dye adverts. So one's about softer, shinier hair, where 85% of our 860 women are agreeing. The other one, which has got Evil Longoria, is all about a colour match, and we're getting that colour match. And obviously they need to have a large panel size for that. So that was 95% of 342 people agree. And again, for a skincare product, we're looking at 362 women over 7 days to say 88% said their skin's visibly smoother. These are really reliable results and really good to use in their marketing. We've also got things online, so website panel sizes. So these are all based on consumer research, so no clinical research here. And this is all about, so skin feeling bouncier, firmer and more toned from L'Oreal. So that's 155 women. Elemis have got some statements about their superfood facial cleanser and their independent user trials with 134 people. You get these really weird numbers, by the way. And I want to mention that's what Thomas was saying earlier, where we'll send a certain amount of products out to get responses back. So where it says, they wouldn't have sent out 155 products or 134 products, but that's the amount of responses they get back. So if you ever see that, that is why that is. And the same with Charlotte Tilbury with 103 women. So we'd have sent out 120 products and got 103 responses back. So you can see these really great claims that have been made. And again, they're all over 100 responses. You don't want to see anything lower than that, really. And finally, I also want to talk about social media and how important that is. So John Frieda have got a huge study of 95% of people agreeing their hair felt softer after use. And that was out of 3,142 responders, which is huge. I mean, over 90% with that many responses is incredibly large. So it's a really, really good statistic for them to use. And again, Estee Lauder, I've got 90% of the women saying their skin felt softer and smoother after using their serum. And that's on 543 women. So there's just no way when you've got this kind of these kinds of numbers, these panel numbers, there's no way if you're quoting it, your competitors are probably going to complain about it because they can see really clearly what you've used. There's no way your consumers are probably going to complain about it because the same thing. And there's no way that any kind of regulatory body is going to kind of come at you about their sample size, they may have a check-in and make sure you're not lying. But as long as you
and they might check actually how you've recruited them. Huh?
Exactly, yeah.
because this actually was a sample. This John Frieda one was a sampling campaign, which is certainly a bit away from a representative sample of users. So this is something that people might argue about, but not the sample size.
Exactly. And the sample size is great, but it's also really important to make sure you're using a reliable testing house, which obviously we will talk about. But no, it is really important, because if people, if these regulatory bodies are to look at that kind of sample size, they may question it if it's too big as well. So it's really important to ensure you've used a company that is recruiting volunteers in the correct way, that, you know, is doing a representative panel, all of these kinds of things. And again, really important to make sure that these are done unbranded for your claim substantiation, which you can see sometimes when you see campaigns like this. They might be sending out branded samples to get responses. And I would, if anybody's been using people like that, I've seen quite a few out there, I would say don't do it. Make sure you're using independent testing houses that are not branding your samples, because if it's branded, there's a bias and your results will not hold up against advertising regulations. So Thomas, we talk a little bit now about comparison testing.
Yeah, just another example that struck us when we talked about sample sizes, and I think where it's even maybe even more important than in other areas. You know about comparison testing. We might do it against an old versus a new version of your product, or versus competition, or versus different variants. In the end, normally you want to find out if one product is better than the other, or but again, difference in the end, to be sure, means statistical difference. So if we have an example over here where we had two products, product A and product B, and again, a kind of 5-point scale of acceptance, you would say, great, product A is 4.3, is better than product B with 3.8, so achieved. So we are clearly better than product A than product B. Yes, maybe. Again, because this is in the end, this links back to the sample size. Yeah, and you can show the next chart, Carys, where I just made random examples, where we going back to the visualization we had before, and you can visualize this also with the confidence intervals. Yeah, you can go to the next chart, where I just took the example that we had before, where we would have the same means, 3.8 and 4.3. But with a low sample size, that could mean that the confidence intervals overlap a lot, which means the real mean value of some product A might be anywhere between 3.9 and 4.7. And for product B, it might be between 3.4 and 4.2, which means there's a huge overlap. So in the end, you don't know if they are different, because chances are high that they can be the same, because the confidence intervals overlap. If we take a reasonable sample size, a higher sample size, you can see that the confidence intervals do not overlap, which means very, very, very likely the samples are really different, and you can claim that they are different, and product A is better than product B, and also can give you for instance, if you are really looking for a new variant, gives you the confidence to change and to start working on a new formulation, for instance. So for a comparison test with a low sample size doesn't make any sense, because in all likelihood you will not find significant differences. So if you invest in a comparison test, which there are many good reasons for, make sure that you have a reasonable sample size, so that in the end you've got results that you can work with.
And really touching on the regulation side of comparison claims as well. So obviously this isn't just about the sample size, but just things to think about, and how important it is to have really reliable data, essentially. So just some information from the ASA again, about what, you know, the purpose of comparisons really are. Really, when you're making a comparison claim, you are most likely going to be going after a competitor, or at least going saying that you're kind of the best or the leader in your, you know, in your field. So generally saying, yeah, you're better, or you're cheaper, or we have, you know, more consumers, this kind of thing. And it's really common to see. It's very common to see in other countries, more kind of outside of the EU, when you actually have really direct competitor claims, particularly in the States. But also, you know, we do have it in the EU as well, but it would be much more likely to say the leading brand and things like this, and kind of keep it kind of blinded to who the competitors are. But either way, it's a really good way to get yourself assessed with your benchmark as your competitors. And also you can look at things like claims for against yourself. So it could be things like new and improved formulation. So yeah, it's really important to kind of think about the kind of claims that you are making, and you need to be really cautious to make claims like best and leading and cheapest, because you are really putting yourself out there against the whole market. So, usually if we do a comparison study, it might be 2 or 3 or 4, maybe, up to 8 products, but we're not testing against the many thousands that are on the market. If you're making a claim like that, you're much more likely to be trying to look at market share and stuff like that, because it would almost be impossible to compare every single competitor. So don't go making the claim if you haven't got that kind of data. But also just thinking about other, but really specifically about identifiable competitors and the information you need, again, about making it reliable. So you're allowed to make these kinds of claims as long as you are not misleading them. So it needs to be based on objective data. You need to have a really good study behind it. And just to make it really clear, you need to have relevant, verifiable, and representative evidence. And all of that can only be covered if you have a very large panel size. As Thomas said, the statistics itself, you need to have a good amount there when it comes to comparisons to say really clearly A is better than B, or however you're going to say it. But also you need to be able to prove that the sample that you've got is representative, and you've not, if we're looking at this really classic case of Pepsi and cola, always really competing against each other. If cola was to say, better tasting than Pepsi, but only tested on Coke drinkers, well, that would be really, really unfair. So we need to really prove that we've got something representative there. So yeah, always make sure that you're really conscious as well of what the regulations are where you're advertising about competitive claims, because there are some really, really strict rules out there, and in certain countries you're not even allowed to name competitors. So also I just want to talk about the idea of looking at these representative panels globally. So when we're talking about making sure that you have a representative panel, if you are advertising across the globe, you don't necessarily need to test in every single country that you are selling in, but you do need to make sure you're representing it. So for example, if we were looking at, say, having a long-lasting foundation and you're selling it globally, but you just tested it in the UK, whereas we've got very dry climate here, quite cold, you might find that a foundation lasts all day. But if we were to replicate that study in Thailand or Malaysia, where it's very humid, would you get the same results? Possibly not. So to use the evidence from one country into another would be very unfair. So we really need to consider those kinds of claims and how they can be affected. So that's also another thing about panel sizes, because you need to have sort of a significant amount of people in each of those countries as well. But I really wanted to point out and just sort of say we are obviously global. But here is a list of some really good countries to think about as well. So when we're looking at those representative panels, as I say, you don't have to test in every single one. But if you were selling in all of these continents, you would really want to think about where you can look at focusing your testing. And this is the kind of recommendation that we would put out there. So it just gives you an idea of some really good panel sizes that we've got. So really a summary of today. Thomas, would you like to summarize for us, actually?
I can start. Yeah, just to recap a bit of the statistics, we've got the confidence intervals because they show the area that the real mean value will be in. So that's why it's a very useful tool to look at. The size of confidence intervals depends on the size of the sample size in a nonlinear way. The higher n, the smaller the confidence interval. Which means you're by having bigger sample sizes, you're narrowing the scope the real value can be in. Going with low sample size increases the risk of outliers, misleading results. You've seen this with the example where we took the first third of the sample, where you would have come to wrong results. This is especially important in comparison testing, where your significant difference will only show up with sizable sample sizes. And another thing to add is the smaller the differences between the products, the higher the sample size need to be able to visualize them. So sometimes you've got very small, if you have a product improvement, a very small product improvement, you really need a big sample size to highlight them and to make sure people realize this. And it is significant. Okay, I think, Carys, you've got a few more points here.
Yeah, I'll cover these. So yeah, we always need to consider your key markets before placing the order. So this is where I was just touching on them when I was saying about making sure you've got a representative. The best thing you can do when you're thinking about doing consumer research is consider who is your consumer and where are you selling your product before you start thinking about the study design, because that is really going to influence it. Certainly, as I said, when it comes to thinking about these sample sizes. So there's a few things here to consider. One is your key markets. Where are you going to sell this product and have we covered them? It might be that we can cover your whole global market within 2. It might be that we suggest more, but this is a conversation that's really important to have before you place your order. Also think about any panel requirements, so things like for all skin types, because as I've been touching on earlier, we need to make sure we have a representative of each skin type on the panel, and that's really the case for any kind of breakdown like that. I also, as mentioned from the ASA, really think about the inclusivity of your brand before you place the order. So even if we leave the panel open, for example, so if we're looking at a UK study, for example, and you're like, well, we're really inclusive, so we're just going to leave it open for whoever, the chances are it's going to be a Caucasian woman, because that is a huge, huge basis of our panel in the UK, just because that is the general kind of largest demographic of people who have signed up to be free testers. However, we do have a nationally representative panel. So if you let us know before you do the study that you want to include that, we can make sure we will recruit accordingly. But leaving it open and leaving it to chance isn't a good way of being inclusive as a brand. So in general, we recommend at least 100 responses, but as mentioned, there will be other factors, but it's just kind of your main takeaway for today is always kind of think about 100 responses before you think about everything else. And then at least you've got a guideline, because I can't tell you how many people have asked me if I can do 20 as a panel size. So try and think bigger, basically, always think bigger is what I would kind of say. So before we go to a question and answer, and I will say, think about questions now. Give me and Thomas a really great challenge today, and feel free to start typing those in. But while you're thinking about your questions, I just want to talk a little bit about more about Ayton Global Research and why you should use us as a testing house. So we're an award-winning research agency. We've won awards for family business, international business, hopefully winning some more awards this year. Now award season seems to be back on. We're fully compliant with the GDPR, and we have an ISO 27001, so we get audited on this process. This is really important for us because, as we mentioned, we have this huge global panel of volunteers. We need to make sure we're protecting them, but also we need to be protecting your data as well. You're giving us really sensitive data about your products. We have undesirable event reporting, which is made in accordance with the Cosmetovigilance Act. We touched a little bit about actual use earlier, and it's a really important thing to mention as well, is that we're also gathering that actual use reflection of undesirable events, which is really good for your advertising, well, for your product information file and things like that. Not necessarily for your advertising, but we also have product liability insurance. So we are protected basically wherever we sell, wherever we conduct consumer research, to make sure if anyone was to misuse your product and had some kind of horrible irritation, at least we're all protected there. We have an ISO 9001, which is about quality assurance. We are a partner to the Market Research Society, so we have training for study design, questionnaire design, but it also means you know that our research is ethical. You have bespoke regulatory advice. That is what I'm here for. Anything I can help with, always feel free to reach out and I will do my utmost. And you always get a designated study manager. So no matter where you're conducting your study, where you're from in the world, you'll get one point of contact who will guide you through the whole process. So you're not passed around a team. They'll understand everything about you, your research objectives, your procedures as a brand, and really make sure they're carried through. So through to question and answer, and I can see we've had a question, which is great. So just to read this out, we've got a key market for one of our customers is China. Would it be possible to access a panel suitable for this market within the UK? So it's a really good question. And I would always say that if you have a key market like that, it's really worth testing in that country. So we can always test, you know, we can recruit Chinese volunteers in the UK, but it's not a true representation because there's slightly different ambient temperatures. You know, there's a slightly different culture, all these kinds of things that are put into account. So really, you really want to reflect as close as possible the people that you are looking to sell your product with. So we do have really extensive panels in China and a really good process for running studies out there. So again, instead of kind of thinking, oh, I hope we can do it in the UK instead, there is absolutely no need. Run the study in China, get that best representation, and yeah, make sure that you've got some really good data there. I would say particularly, obviously, there is the new CSAR regulation in China about cosmetics. There is some really clear guidance from the NMPA about claim substantiation. It doesn't necessarily say that it has to be conducted in China, but I would just say that they are getting very tight with their regulations about claim substantiation. So if there's anything you can do to avoid someone kind of questioning your data and saying whether it's valid, doing things like making sure it's conducted in your key markets would be a very smart move. So I can't see any other questions coming in. I don't know if you have any other comments on that one, Thomas, as well.
No, I absolutely agree. I think test in the country. My message is always test as close as possible to reality, into a real consumer reality. And if you take Chinese people in UK, it's not the real reality for China. There's different conditions, different climate. Also, the people will not be representative because not every ordinary Chinese person will have the opportunity to live in the UK. So this will be slightly distorted.
Absolutely. I can't see any other questions coming in, but as always, I will send out me and Thomas's contact information with the follow-up email, which will include the recording of today's webinar. So if you've got any questions you want to follow up with, please do just feel free to reach out at any time. We've got another question coming, which is great. It always happens. So in the case of a comparison testing, why not use a paired design? So paired testing methodology, I think.
Yeah. So the question for comparison testing, I think I think we even made a full webinar on comparison testing because the design needs to be adapted to the question. So you can make a monadic design where you have two different test cells. You can have a paired design where you test products one after the other. You can have an extreme, also paired design, but it depends a lot on what you want to find out. And of course, the sensitivity also plays a role in depending on the test design. So this is something, if you have a specific case, discuss this with us. This is more than we can answer in 1 minute or two. You can use a paired design, but it depends on what you want to find out.
Absolutely. I think today we're really reflecting just the statistics behind the panel size. But as Thomas said, we do have an entire webinar, which is just based on comparison testing. Please do feel free to reach out. I don't want to say your name in case you want to keep anonymous, but please do feel free to reach out when we send out the recording and ask for that link directly, or you can visit our YouTube channel and it's all on there as well. But it might be something, you find really interesting, or if you've got a particular project, do let us know. Great. So I think I'm going to finish on with the webinar, but if any other questions come in, I'll either answer them now or email separately. So we've got one more upcoming webinar for February. I will be releasing the March schedule soon, but there's a last webinar for February coming up next week, which is going to be with me and Thomas again, and it is about cosmetic trends for 2021. This is where we'll take apart some trends that we expect to happen, and we're going to look at the claims that are on those kinds of trends and how you can substantiate them. I also just want to point you in the direction of the Society of Cosmetic Scientists. They've got their distance learning course, which is an essential course in the a course in the essentials of cosmetic science, and you can do that anywhere in the world at any time. So there's a link there if you want to find out some more information. There's also going to be the IFSCC Congress, which we're very, very proud to host in London in 2022. So hopefully by that point, we'll all be up to meet in person, and you can register your interest already on the website there. So there is me and Thomas's contact information. Thomas, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Carys.
And thank you everyone for joining as well.
Thank you.
I will send out the recording shortly, but have a lovely weekend, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.